When I first started making these videos, a big motivation for it was that I thought I had something valuable to say. I thought I had some knowledge, some wisdom, some perspective on the world that would benefit people if I shared it. I didn't know how much it would benefit, maybe a lot, maybe a little, but I was pretty convinced that there was things I had to say that would be useful for the world to hear. I did have an understanding that I wasn't there yet, right? I needed to refine it more. I needed to understand it better. There was too many things I didn't know. I needed to work on it more. And that's why I started doing these videos, to try and do that, to try and refine whatever the message is, whatever the things that I thought were valuable that I wanted to put out to the world to help people. And I've found a lot of value in doing these videos. Perhaps the most important thing I found was something that I guess if I'm being honest, I didn't necessarily expect to find, although in hindsight, it should have been clear as day because it's so obvious. And it relates to a Gandhi quote, a famous one, most probably have heard it. This idea of being the change you want to see in the world, right? Meaning if you want the world to be a certain way, if you think people would be better off acting a certain way, you have to live that first. You should be the first, right? You live that, be the change that you want to see. And I say that related to what I've learned in these videos because that's kind of sums up the realization that I've started to come to over these last few months of doing these videos. What started more as, again, I have some perspective or some insight or some wisdom that I need to put outward, has started to shift, and just started because this is a process, and it's not an easy one. It started to shift more to realizing what I'm really trying to do, or I should be trying to do, is figuring out how do I change myself? How do I impact myself? How do I be the change I want to see in the world? So don't worry about, schooling somebody else or teaching somebody else. I need to figure it out first. And, probably a few years ago, certainly 5-10 years ago, that thought would have never crossed my mind because I was pretty sure I had figured it out. I was pretty sure I was a smart, thoughtful, aware person who had good perspective on things. So I was already doing the things I should be doing. It's only through the hard exercise of thinking better that we talk about the mental toughness, the awareness, the vulnerability, the willingness to face these inner identity issues and biases and flaws in how we think. It's only when you're willing to do that you can really start to, in my case, be the change I want to see in the world. And again, I think these videos have started to help me to get there. And it made me realize something around some of the things that are happening right now, around the George Floyd incident, the protests going on, and an interaction I had with a friend kind of brought some of this together for me a bit. And again, it's still a work in process, still something that I'm trying to work through, but I'll give you kind of the genesis of it. So, right now, today was Blackout Tuesday. So the idea was a lot of companies were blacking out business. People on social media were posting black screens. There's a lot, there's protests still going on. There's lots going on. A lot of people speaking out, celebrities, everyday people. There's a lot of focus on the cause right now. The cause being racism in America, Black Lives Matter kind of movement, and how do we help that? And what I started to witness, right, what I thought I was starting to witness was an interesting, social dynamic, where as this focus grew and built, and again, particularly today, Blackout Tuesday, you go on social media, it's everywhere. It's in the streets, it's everywhere. You start to see what some psychologists would call, or sociologists would call, like a kickback effect, where for some people, as that focus raises, they start to push back on it. And there's almost like an anger or an emotional reaction to it, where it bothers them in some way. And I found that really interesting, right? Whenever something like that happens, I dig in on it and I want to understand it. So I started thinking about, hey, what's happening here? And I started formulating this theory, which is just a theory at this point, that what I think is happening is we as a society are not particularly good at practicing empathy. we humans in general, I think, are somewhat hardwired to be more self-centered, self-involved. Not everybody, but most people. Self-preservation is what it's about. I'm looking out for me. I'm looking out for my family. There's a self-centeredness, a self-involvedness that goes against empathy. So on a regular basis, we don't do a good enough job of practicing empathy. Some people do, but most don't. So I say that because when something like this happens and a cause comes up where so much empathy and so much caring and focus is pushed towards one cause, you start to get these reactions from people, from everyday people, whoever it is, individuals, that feel like, hey, I got stuff going on in my life too, right? Maybe I had a parent that died, or maybe my kid's sick, or I got laid off from work, or whatever the issue is, right? I grew up in a really tough neighborhood. My parents abused me, whatever it might be. And my theory is that they start to form this thought of like, hey, I'm all for helping people for sure, but I'm seeing all this focus on this one cause. Like, nobody's checking in on me. I don't see any random people coming to say, hey, how are you doing? You've been through some stuff. And it's not about comparing racism to this, right? It's not necessarily a rational thought. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just trying to highlight what I think is at play. I think that's what starts to happen for some people. And the reaction is that kickback effect of like, hey, let's take it down a notch. I'm all for supporting, but this seems to be going overboard. And it seems like there's an imbalance here. It seems like so much empathy is being directed towards this cause, but what about everything else? What about people that die of opioid overdoses? Or what about people that have been molested by the Catholic Church, or whatever the cause is, right? There's this feeling of like, we're getting imbalanced here. We're pushing too much on one thing, which is a bad thing, right? In theory, you should care about all of it. But again, I say that's not how we function as a race, as a human race. We tend to be more inward looking. So you have this imbalance. You have these people feeling like there's a disproportionate amount of empathy being pushed towards a certain way, and it triggers them. And I started to kind of kick around that theory that's what I think is happening. And where I went from there is, the solution is these people that are having this kickback, you need to show more empathy, right? Because probably what they're thinking is, hey, making it up, but Black Lives Matter advocate, where were you last year? Where were you last month when there was a different cause that wasn't your cause? Were you out there marching? Were you out there supporting it? Were you making posts on social media? Were you demanding that people focus on this other cause that wasn't near and dear to your heart? And the thought is, well, you weren't. Therefore, why do you expect everybody else to get so galvanized behind this one? And it's not a good way of thinking, again, but I think it's a realistic way that some people think. They start to do this. It always comes back to a calculation for me of like, something's off here, something's imbalanced. So to me, the answer started to come about of, you can only control yourself. You can only control yourself individually. So you should start to put that empathy out there. If everybody individually puts that empathy out there now, right? Because it's like, if you need an apple today, and you plant the apple tree today, well, you're screwed because you're going to be waiting a long time. You got to plant those seeds, a few years ago so that you can get your apples today. So we got to start now. Start putting that empathy out there, and I think that'll help to solve the problem. So I was pretty proud of myself. I felt like this was a relatively good theory, something to kick around more and discuss, and I started discussing it with a few people. And the more I discussed it, the more I realized, like, this may say more about me than it does anybody else. And I'm sure it applies to other people. But back to the point in the beginning of this video, be the change you want to see in the world. What's the value these videos are bringing to me? And the more I think about it, I think it's making me realize these are things that, flaws and issues that I have, things that I need to work through, right? And I mentioned there was an incident or an interaction with a friend that helped me highlight this. So I have a really good friend I've known since junior high who's Black. And I reached out to him a couple days ago just to see how he was doing, understand where his head was at, learn from him a little bit about this situation, because that's what I'm trying to practice what I preach. And it was a good conversation. And I'm sure there was a level of appreciation that I reached out. But as I thought about it through this lens of this theory that I'm kicking around, I started thinking, he was appreciative to an extent, but there was a little bit of like almost, if I had to say it simply, like an expectation of like, I'm not surprised you reached out. Like, I'm going through something here. My people are going through something. You reached out to check in as you should have. And here's some things I think you can do to help the cause, which is good. That's what I wanted. But I started thinking and realizing like, hey, that's that imbalance I was talking about. Because if I start to dig inward a little bit, I start to realize there's a part of me that's saying like, hey, I've been through some stuff over the last few years. I don't think this friend ever reached out to me just to say, how you doing? Like, how are things? Now, I'm not trying to say the scale is equivalent, the race issue versus what I've been going through. It's not about that. And being frank, I'm acknowledging a flaw. So I'm not trying to defend myself because I'm acknowledging that this is a bad thing that I do. But I recognize that I was keeping score of that a little bit. I was looking at him, and there was a part of me that was feeling like, no, I know I'm reaching out and it's the right thing to do and all that, but like, I'm not sure you're giving back what I'm giving you or you ever have. And it made me, again, get back to this point of, well, that's a problem. That's a problem for me because I want to be the change I want to see in the world. I don't want to be the person keeping score. I want to be the person that's putting it out there so that it could pay it forward. So that if I reach out to this person, I do it genuinely. And I do it to that person and this person and that person. And hopefully that starts to motivate and inspire people to also put empathy out there, to put compassion out there. And maybe that'll trigger something because that's all I can control is myself. I can only do the next right thing, right? To try and be the change I want to see in the world and I want in the world. So uncovering these things is super critical. And it's interesting to me how my mind works and maybe others I assume, but definitely mine, where my first instinct is to project that on other people. Hey, I see that in other people. I think that's what they're doing. Let me school them on how to fix it. Well, I got to start here. I got to fix it first. But you have to become aware of it. And our mind is so quick to say, no, not me. Not me. That's other people are doing that. They're being irrational or acting wrong. But it was, in fact, me. So a valuable lesson for me to try and continually put this thing inwards. Figure out how I can be better so I can be the change I want to see.